Welcome. You have made it here, to this quiet hour. Take a moment now. Let the day settle behind you. Tonight, we are going to follow soldiers through a winter night during the Second World War. These were men stationed along the front lines in some of the coldest conditions recorded in modern conflict. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Celsius, sometimes lower. Snow covered the ground for months. Daylight was brief. In this environment, sleep was not simply rest. It was survival. How did these men manage to close their eyes when the cold could kill them in their sleep? How did they find warmth in frozen earth, surrounded by enemies, with nothing but wool and canvas between them and the night? There was no single answer. It was a combination of shelter, clothing, routine, and the presence of others. Each element depended on the next. Over the next while, we will move through one winter night on the front lines. We will see how soldiers prepared as darkness fell, how they kept themselves alive through the hours of cold, and how they woke again when morning came. So, settle in. The winters of 1941 through 1945 brought some of the most severe cold ever experienced by organized military forces. On the Eastern Front, where German and Soviet armies faced each other across vast stretches of steppe and forest, temperatures regularly dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. In some places, it went lower, minus 30, minus 40. In the west, the Ardennes forest along the border between Belgium and Germany saw its own brutal winter in 1944. American soldiers who had expected to fight in France found themselves in dense woods under heavy snow. The temperatures were not as extreme as those in Russia, but they were cold enough. Cold enough to freeze water in canteens. Cold enough to stiffen uniforms into rigid shells. Cold enough to make sleep dangerous. These were not places designed for human habitation in winter. The forests were thick with evergreens, the ground uneven and rocky. There were no towns nearby, no heated buildings to retreat to. Soldiers lived in the open, or in holes they dug themselves, surrounded by snow and ice. The environment itself became an adversary. It did not attack with violence, but with patience. It worked slowly, consistently, hour by hour. It pulled heat from the body, from metal, from fabric. It turned moisture into ice. For the men stationed there, the cold was not a backdrop to the war. It was a central fact of existence. It governed what they wore, where they slept, how they moved. It determined whether they would wake in the morning. Combat came in bursts. Artillery fire, small arms exchanges, patrols. But the cold was constant. It simply continued, night after night, week after week. And so the soldiers adapted. They learned to read the cold the way sailors read the sea. They learned which materials held warmth and which conducted it away. They learned how to position their bodies, how to share heat, how to build small sanctuaries in frozen ground. This was not knowledge they brought with them. Most of these men came from temperate climates. They had never slept outdoors in winter, never dug into frozen earth, never depended on another person's body heat to survive the night. They learned because they had to. The alternative was straightforward. The landscape taught them. The snow, the wind, the frozen soil. Each night was a lesson. Some lessons were gentle, others were not. By the winter of 1943, soldiers on all sides had developed routines. The German forces, after their catastrophic first winter in Russia, had begun to adapt their equipment and tactics. The Soviets, who had spent centuries living in this climate, refined their methods further. The Americans, arriving in Europe in large numbers, absorbed what they could from their allies and from their own brutal education in the Ardennes. But before any routine, before any adaptation, there was the simple fact of the landscape itself. The long nights, the deep cold, the silence of snow falling in the dark. This was the world they had to sleep in. The ground was frozen solid by mid-December. In some places, it froze down to a depth of several feet. The standard entrenching tool, a small folding shovel carried by infantry, could not break through the surface. When they did not, they used explosives, carefully placed to fracture the earth without drawing enemy fire. The trees stood bare in many places, their branches heavy with snow. In the evergreen forests, the snow collected on the boughs, muffling sound. The world became quieter in winter. Footsteps were absorbed. Voices did not carry as far. Even the sound of distant artillery became softer, more distant. During the day, there was movement. Soldiers on patrol, supply lines bringing rations and ammunition, officers moving between positions. But at night, everything slowed. Movement drew attention. Light was forbidden. The only sounds were the wind, the occasional crack of a frozen branch, and the low voices of men huddled together in the dark. The Eastern Front stretched for hundreds of miles. The Western Front was more compact, but still vast by the standards of individual experience. A soldier stationed in one section might never see another part of the line. His world was the few hundred yards around his position, the foxhole he shared with one or two others, the stretch of forest or open ground he could see from his post. In this small world, the cold was everything. It shaped time. The day was divided not by the clock, but by the progression of light and temperature. Dawn brought a slight warming, enough to make movement easier. Dusk marked the beginning of the long, dangerous night. And the coldest hours came just before dawn, when the body's reserves were lowest and the temperature dropped to its minimum. It shaped space. The places that offered shelter from the wind became vital. A depression in the ground, a cluster of trees, the lee side of a ridge. Soldiers mapped their surroundings not by tactical features alone, but by thermal features. Where could you find relief from the wind? Where did snow accumulate, and where did it blow clear? And it shaped the body. Soldiers learned to recognize the early signs of cold injury. The tingling in the fingers, the numbness in the toes, the way their thoughts began to slow, becoming thick and uncertain. They learned to monitor themselves and each other, watching for the small changes that signaled danger. This was the landscape, cold, patient, indifferent. And in this landscape, every night, men had to find a way to sleep. The human body is designed to maintain a core temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. This is not a preference, it is a requirement. When the air temperature drops below freezing, the body begins to make automatic adjustments. These adjustments happen without conscious thought, governed by systems far older than language or culture. The first response is vasoconstriction. The small blood vessels near the skin, in the fingers and toes, begin to narrow. This reduces blood flow to the extremities and keeps warm blood circulating around the vital organs. The heart, the lungs, the brain, these must be protected first. This is a form of triage. The body is deciding which parts of itself it can afford to sacrifice. The fingers can lose sensation, can even freeze, and the organism will survive. But if the core temperature drops too far, all systems fail. Soldiers experience this every day. Within minutes of being exposed to the cold, their hands would begin to stiffen. Fine motor skills became difficult. Buttoning a coat, loading a rifle, striking a match. The feet were even more vulnerable. Boots offered some insulation, but not enough. The ground pulled heat directly through the soles. Soldiers learned to keep moving during the day, flexing their toes inside their boots, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Stillness allowed the cold to settle in. At night, when movement was restricted, the risk increased. A soldier lying in a foxhole could not walk around to generate heat. He had to rely on insulation and on the proximity of others, but the body's protective measures created their own problems. As blood flow to the extremities decreased, the tissues in the fingers and toes began to cool. If the exposure continued, the tissues would begin to freeze. Ice crystals formed in the cells, rupturing their walls. This was frostbite. In mild cases, frostbite caused pain and blistering. The skin turned white, then red, then purple. The affected area swelled. Recovery took weeks. In severe cases, the tissue died. Gangrene set in. Amputation was the only option. The records from the Eastern Front show tens of thousands of cases of frostbite. Some divisions lost more men to cold injury than to enemy action. The hospitals filled with soldiers whose feet had frozen, whose fingers had turned black, whose ears and noses had to be removed. This was the cost of the body's triage. It saved the core, but it sacrificed the periphery. The second major response to cold was shivering. When the core temperature began to drop, the muscles contracted and relaxed rapidly, generating heat through friction. This was effective, but it required energy. Shivering also made sleep difficult. The involuntary muscle contractions kept the soldier in a light, restless state. Deep sleep became nearly impossible, but shivering was a sign that the body was still fighting. When shivering stopped, it meant the body had moved into a more dangerous stage. Hypothermia progresses in stages. The boundaries between these stages are not sharp, but the pattern is consistent. In the first stage, mild hypothermia, the core temperature drops to between 32 and 35 degrees Celsius. The soldier shivers violently. His heart rate increases. He feels cold, intensely, and unmistakably. His thinking becomes confused. He has difficulty making decisions. Small tasks become overwhelming. In the second stage, moderate hypothermia, the core temperature falls to between 28 and 32 degrees. Shivering stops. The muscles become rigid. The heart rate slows. Speech becomes slurred. The soldier may experience hallucinations. He moves slowly, if he moves at all. Lethargy sets in. In the third stage, severe hypothermia, the core temperature drops below 28 degrees. The risk of cardiac arrest becomes acute. The lungs may fill with fluid. Consciousness fades. Death follows. Soldiers learn to recognize these stages in themselves and in each other. The buddy system was not only a tactical measure, it was a biological necessity. A man slipping into hypothermia could not save himself. His judgment was compromised. He needed someone else to notice, to intervene, to force him to move, to share warmth, to keep him awake. But the progression was quiet. There was no alarm, no sudden collapse. It was a slow fading, a gradual loss of capacity. A soldier who seemed fine 1 hour might be incoherent the next, and sleep accelerated the process. During sleep, the metabolic rate naturally declines. The body generates less heat. This is normal and healthy in a warm environment, but in extreme cold, it becomes dangerous. As a soldier entered deeper stages of sleep, his ability to shiver was suppressed. If his insulation was inadequate, if his shelter was insufficient, his core temperature would drop steadily through the night. Some men did not wake up. Burial parties in the morning would find them curled in their foxholes, still and frozen. Sometimes their bodies showed signs of a strange phenomenon. They had removed their clothing, coats, shirts, even trousers, discarded in the snow. This was paradoxical disrobing. It occurred in the final minutes of life. As the body's vascular system failed, the constricted blood vessels suddenly dilated. Warm blood rushed to the skin. The dying soldier felt an intense, burning sensation of heat. It was a hallucination of warmth, and it killed him faster. Another phenomenon was terminal burrowing. Soldiers were found in small, enclosed spaces, under logs, in the corners of dugouts, beneath piles of debris. This was an autonomous response driven by the brainstem. The body sought shelter, sought enclosure, mimicking the behavior of hibernating animals. These were the body's final, automatic choices. Rational thought had already ceased. Only the oldest, deepest instincts remained. The men who survived the winter learned to fear sleep. Not because they did not need it. They were desperately tired, worn down by weeks of inadequate rest. But because sleep was the moment of greatest vulnerability, they learned to wake each other, to check on each other through the night, to recognize the signs of trouble before they became irreversible. They learned that the body, left to itself, would make choices. Sleep is essential. The body requires it. The mind requires it. But sleep is also a state of reduced awareness, lowered defenses, diminished control. For soldiers on the front lines in winter, this created an impossible tension. They needed rest to function. Without it, their judgment failed, their reflexes slowed, their ability to endure collapsed. But the act of sleeping placed them at the mercy of the cold. The problem was metabolic. During waking hours, even at rest, the body maintains a baseline level of heat production. The heart beats steadily. The muscles hold a slight tension. The brain consumes energy. All of this generates warmth. When sleep begins, these processes slow down. The heart rate drops. The muscles relax completely. Brain activity shifts into different patterns. The metabolic rate declines by 10 to 15%. In a normal environment, this is beneficial. The body conserves energy. It performs maintenance and repair. Sleep is restorative. But in temperatures 20 or 30 degrees below freezing, this metabolic slowdown was dangerous. The body's heat production decreased precisely when it was most needed. And as sleep deepened, the body's ability to respond to cold diminished further. Shivering, the primary automatic defense against cold, was suppressed during the deeper stages of sleep. The body prioritized rest over warmth. In a heated room, this did not matter, but in a foxhole in the Ardennes, it could be fatal. Soldiers were caught between two biological imperatives: the need for sleep and the need to maintain body temperature. Both were non-negotiable, and they were in direct conflict. The solution, imperfect as it was, involved careful management of the conditions under which sleep occurred. First, the timing. Sleep could not be continuous. A soldier could not afford to drift into deep sleep for hours at a time. If he did, his core temperature would drop too far, and he might not wake. So sleep was fragmented. Rotations were established. 2 hours on guard, 2 hours resting, or 3 hours and 3 hours. The exact pattern varied by unit and by circumstance, but the principle was universal. Short periods, frequent waking, constant vigilance. This was not restful. 2 hours of sleep, interrupted, did not provide the same restoration as 4 hours of uninterrupted rest. Over days and weeks, the soldiers accumulated a massive sleep debt. They became chronically exhausted, but it kept them alive. Second, the insulation. If the metabolic rate was going to drop during sleep, then the environment had to compensate. The soldier needed enough insulation around him to trap the heat his body was still producing, even at the reduced rate. This meant blankets, coats, and whatever other materials could be layered over and under the sleeping man. It meant shelter overhead to block the wind and hold in a pocket of warmer air. It meant a barrier beneath him to prevent the frozen ground from pulling heat directly out of his body. Even with all of this, the insulation was often barely adequate. A soldier would wake cold, stiff, shivering, but he would wake, third, the proximity of others. This was the most reliable source of additional warmth. A human body at rest produces roughly 100 watts of heat. Not much, by the standards of a furnace, but in the confined space of a foxhole, shared between 2 or 3 men, it made a measurable difference. Soldiers learned to sleep pressed together, not side by side with space between them, but touching, back to chest, legs overlapping, arms around each other. This was not affection, it was physics. 2 bodies sharing a blanket created a combined thermal mass. The heat that radiated from one was absorbed by the other. The air trapped between them warmed slightly. The outer surface area, where heat was lost to the environment, was reduced. This could raise the temperature inside the shared blanket by 10 or even 15 degrees Celsius. The difference between surviving the night and not, but even this had limits. If one man was already hypothermic, his body was no longer generating enough heat to help. The healthy man would have to decide whether to stay close, risking his own temperature drop, or to separate, leaving his companion to die. There are accounts of both choices being made. Fourth, the awareness. Soldiers learned to monitor their own state, even in the fog of exhaustion. They learned the early warning signs, the confusion, the apathy, the feeling that it did not matter anymore, that sleep was more important than warmth. This last symptom was particularly dangerous. As hypothermia progressed, it impaired judgment. The soldier stopped caring about his own survival. He became passive. He would not take the simple actions that could save him. He would not move. He would not wake his companion. He would simply lie there, slipping away. His companion had to notice, had to intervene, had to force him to move, to wake, to respond. The buddy system was built on this mutual dependence. You watched your companion. and he watched you. Neither of you could afford to trust your own judgment when you were cold and exhausted. You needed an external perspective, someone who could see what you could not. This was the social technology that made winter survival possible, but it required trust. It required a willingness to accept vulnerability. It required men to admit to themselves and to each other that they could not do this alone. And so the nights passed in fragments. 2 hours of shallow, restless sleep. 2 hours of standing watch, fighting to stay alert in the cold. Then another 2 hours of sleep. Then another watch, day after day, week after week. The exhaustion accumulated. The soldiers moved through their days in a fog. Their reactions slowed. Their thinking became muddled. Simple tasks required intense concentration. This state was called combat fatigue. It was not cowardice. It was not weakness. It was the predictable result of sustained sleep deprivation combined with extreme environmental stress. Some men broke. They stopped functioning. They sat in their foxholes and stared at nothing. They had reached the limit of what their nervous systems could endure. More than 500,000 American soldiers were lost to psychiatric collapse during the war. Not killed, not wounded by enemy fire, but rendered unable to continue by the accumulated strain on their minds. Sleep deprivation was a major factor, and winter made it worse. The cold prevented deep sleep. The danger prevented continuous sleep. The exhaustion made everything harder, and the cycle fed on itself. But the men who endured found ways to manage. They learned to take what rest they could, when they could. They learned to recognize the signs of breaking in themselves and others. They learned to help each other through the worst hours. And they learned that sleep, in winter, was not a refuge. It was another battle, one that had to be fought carefully, with preparation and vigilance, every single night. There are phenomena that occur at the boundary between life and death from cold. They are rare, but they were documented often enough during the winter campaigns of the Second World War that soldiers learned to recognize them. The first is paradoxical disrobing. A soldier, deep into hypothermia, his core temperature dropping toward the fatal threshold, suddenly begins to remove his clothing, his coat, his shirt, sometimes even his trousers. To an observer, this makes no sense. The man is freezing. Removing his insulation will kill him faster. And yet he does it anyway, driven by a sensation that feels absolutely real to him. He feels hot, burning hot. This is not a psychological delusion. It is a physiological event. Throughout the progression of hypothermia, the body has been constricting the blood vessels in the skin and extremities, trying to keep warm blood circulating around the core. This vasoconstriction is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, the part of the brain that operates below conscious awareness. But as the core temperature drops into the severe range, below 28 degrees Celsius, the system begins to fail. The muscles that constrict the blood vessels, already weakened by cold and lack of oxygen, can no longer maintain their grip. The vessels suddenly dilate. All at once, warm blood, what little warmth remains in the core, rushes out to the skin. The soldier feels a wave of heat spreading across his body. It is intense, overwhelming. He is convinced that he is overheating. In his confused, hypothermic state, he responds to this sensation in the only way that makes sense to him. This is the paradox. The sensation of heat arrives at the moment when the body is coldest, and the response to that sensation accelerates death. Once the clothing is removed, the remaining core heat dissipates rapidly into the air. The core temperature plummets. Cardiac arrest follows within minutes. Burial parties on the Eastern Front and in the Ardennes found bodies in this state regularly. Men lying in the snow, half-dressed or completely naked, surrounded by the clothes they had torn off in their final moments. It was a disturbing sight. It suggested suffering, confusion, a loss of rational thought, and that was exactly what it was. The second phenomenon is terminal burrowing. In the same late stage of hypothermia, as consciousness fades and the higher brain functions shut down, the brainstem takes over. This is the oldest part of the brain, the part that governs the most basic survival instincts. And one of those instincts, shared with many mammalian species, is to seek out a small, enclosed space when dying. Soldiers were found in strange positions, curled under logs, wedged into the corners of dugouts, beneath piles of rubble or equipment, in hollows in the snow that they had scraped out with their hands. They had burrowed. This behavior is seen in animals preparing to hibernate or in animals that are dying from cold. The instinct is to find shelter, to reduce exposure, to create a final refuge. In humans, it appears to be an automatic response triggered by the brainstem when the cortex is no longer functioning. The dying person is not making a conscious decision. They are simply following an impulse, deep and ancient, that tells them to hide. It does not save them. But it is the body's last attempt at self-preservation. These two phenomena, paradoxical disrobing and terminal burrowing, were not common. Most soldiers who died of hypothermia simply stopped moving, stopped responding, and slipped into unconsciousness in place. But the phenomena occurred often enough that they became part of the knowledge passed between soldiers. If you found a man who had removed his clothing, you knew he was in the final stage. If you found a man trying to crawl into a small space, unresponsive and incoherent, you knew the same. And you knew there was likely nothing you could do. By the time these behaviors appeared, the core temperature was too low. The heart was on the edge of stopping. Even if you could rewarm the person, the shock of warming could trigger cardiac arrest. The frozen blood in the extremities, suddenly pushed back toward the heart, could cause a fatal drop in core temperature. This was called afterdrop, and it killed people even after they had been rescued from the cold. So the medics learned to rewarm slowly, to focus on the core first, to avoid vigorous movement, to handle the hypothermic patient gently, as though they were made of glass. But on the front lines, there were no medics nearby most of the time. There was no warm room to bring someone to. There was only the foxhole, the blankets, and the body heat of companions. If a soldier reached the stage of paradoxical disrobing, he was almost certainly beyond help. The men who survived learned to prevent it. They learned to recognize the earlier stages, the confusion, the slurred speech, the apathy. They learned to intervene before the final stage arrived. They learned to keep each other awake, to force movement, to share warmth aggressively, piling onto a companion who was slipping away, using their combined body heat to stabilize him. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not, but the paradoxes at the edge remained, a reminder that the body, when pushed to its limits, behaves in ways that defy logic, that the sensation of heat can arrive in the coldest moment, that the instinct to hide can emerge when hiding does no good. These were the body's final messages. Not rational, not helpful, but deeply, unavoidably human. Before a soldier could sleep, he had to have a place to sleep. And in winter, that place had to be created. The ground was frozen. In the forests of Belgium, in the fields of Eastern Europe, the soil turned hard in December and remained that way until March or April. The frost line, the depth to which the ground froze, extended down several feet in some areas. Digging into this ground was not a simple task. The standard infantry entrenching tool was a small, folding shovel. It could cut through roots, move loose dirt, carve out a shallow trench in a few hours of steady work, but it could not break frozen ground. Soldiers learned this quickly. They would strike the surface with the edge of the shovel and feel the jarring impact as the tool bounced off. The ground was like stone. Sometimes it was stone, frozen so hard that it rang when struck. So they adapted. The first method was to use pickaxes. These were heavier, longer tools with a pointed metal head. A soldier could swing a pickaxe with enough force to fracture the frozen surface. It required strength and time. Each stroke chipped away a small piece of ice and soil. Progress was slow, but it worked. Not every unit had pickaxes. They were heavy and difficult to transport. In mobile operations, they were often left behind. So soldiers improvised. Some used bayonets, driving them into the ground repeatedly to create a starting point. Others used the butts of their rifles, though this risked damaging the weapon. Still others found rocks and used them as hammers, pounding at the frozen surface until it cracked. In the most extreme cases, they used explosives. A small charge, carefully placed, could shatter the frozen crust, and make digging possible. But this was dangerous. The explosion drew attention. It revealed the position. And it risked injury from flying debris. So explosives were used sparingly, only when there was no other option. Once the surface was broken, the digging could begin. The goal was to create a hole deep enough to provide cover from enemy fire and wind. Depth varied depending on the situation. In active combat zones, a foxhole might be dug to chest height or deeper, allowing a soldier to stand upright and still be below the level of the surrounding ground. In quieter sectors, where the primary concern was shelter from the cold rather than from bullets, the hole might be shallower, just deep enough to get below the wind, just wide enough for two men to lie side by side. The shape of the hole mattered. A simple vertical shaft was not enough. Soldiers learned to dig a sump, a small drainage channel at the bottom of the foxhole. This allowed water to collect away from the sleeping area. Water was a constant problem. Snow would fall into the foxhole. Body heat would melt it. The meltwater would pool at the bottom. If a soldier lay in that water, his clothing would soak through. Wet clothing lost its insulating properties, and wet clothing, in freezing temperatures, could kill. So the sump drained the water to one side. The soldier slept on a slightly raised platform, keeping himself dry. The next step was insulation. The floor of the foxhole was still frozen earth. It would pull heat directly out of the body through conduction. A soldier lying on bare ground would lose warmth continuously, no matter how many blankets he piled on top of himself. The solution was to create a barrier. The most common material was fir boughs. Soldiers would cut branches from nearby evergreen trees and lay them at the bottom of the foxhole. The branches were arranged with the cut ends toward the feet and the tips toward the head. This created a springy, uneven surface that lifted the body slightly off the ground. More importantly, it trapped air. The spaces between the needles and branches held pockets of still air. Air is a poor conductor of heat. The fir boughs acted like a primitive mattress, reducing the transfer of warmth from the body to the frozen earth below. Where fir trees were not available, soldiers used whatever they could find. Straw, if they could scavenge it from abandoned farms. Dry grass, even crumpled paper, if they had it. Anything that created a layer of trapped air between them and the ground. The overhead cover was equally important. Without it, the soldier was exposed to wind, snow, and the open sky. Heat radiated upward, lost to the air. The wind pulled warmth away faster than the body could replace it. So soldiers built roofs. The simplest version was a shelter half, a piece of canvas designed to be combined with another soldier's shelter half to form a small tent. In a foxhole, a single shelter half could be stretched across the opening, anchored with rocks or frozen clods of dirt. This provided some protection. But it was not enough in the coldest weather. The better version involved logs. If there were trees nearby, soldiers would cut small logs and lay them across the top of the foxhole, creating a frame. The shelter half went over the logs, and then, if there was enough snow, they would pile snow on top of the canvas. Snow, like fir boughs, was an insulator. The air trapped between the snow crystals prevented heat from escaping. A thick layer of snow, a foot or more, could make the interior of the foxhole noticeably warmer than the outside air. The entrance was left partially open, just enough for a man to crawl in and out. Some soldiers hung a blanket or a piece of cloth over the entrance to block drafts, but it could not be sealed completely. The men inside needed fresh air. Carbon dioxide buildup in a sealed space could cause unconsciousness. So the foxhole was a carefully balanced system, deep enough for protection, insulated below to prevent conduction, covered above to trap warmth, drained to stay dry, ventilated to stay safe. Building it took hours, sometimes an entire day, if the ground was particularly hard or the tools were inadequate. But once it was built, it became home. A small, dark, cold space that was nonetheless better than the open air. A place where sleep, fragile and brief, was possible. Not all soldiers had time to build proper foxholes. In fast-moving operations, they slept wherever they stopped, in ditches, behind walls, in the open. These were the worst nights. The nights when the cold was unrelenting, when there was no shelter, no insulation, no relief. But when they had time, they dug. They broke the frozen earth and carved out a place for themselves. They lined it with branches and covered it with snow. They made it as warm as they could, and then, when night fell, they crawled inside and hoped it would be enough. The foxhole was more than a hole in the ground. It was a deliberate structure, shaped by the requirements of survival. Every detail mattered. The angle of the walls, the placement of the drainage channel, the thickness of the overhead cover. These were not aesthetic choices. They were engineering decisions that determined whether the occupants would live through the night. The walls of the foxhole were typically angled outward slightly at the top. This served two purposes. First, it prevented the walls from collapsing inward under the weight of snow. Second, it created a wider opening at the surface, making it easier to enter and exit quickly if needed. But the walls could not be too wide. A foxhole that was too spacious lost the advantage of confined space. The heat generated by the soldiers' bodies would dissipate into a larger volume of air. The goal was to create just enough room for the men inside, with minimal extra space. 2 men could share a foxhole roughly 1 meter wide and 2 meters long. 3 men required a slightly larger space, but not much. The dimensions were constrained by practicality. A larger hole took longer to dig, required more materials to cover, and was harder to keep warm. The depth varied by location and purpose. On the eastern front, where artillery was constant, foxholes were often dug deeper, sometimes to shoulder height or more. The extra depth provided protection from shrapnel and shell fragments. But deeper holes were also colder. The farther down into the earth, the more heat was lost to the surrounding frozen soil. In the Ardennes, where the immediate threat was often small arms fire and the cold itself, foxholes were sometimes shallower, deep enough to get below the wind and below the line of sight, but not so deep that they became thermal sinks. The floor required careful attention. After the initial digging, after the sump was carved out, the soldiers would smooth the sleeping area as much as possible. Sharp rocks were removed. The surface was leveled. Any remaining ice was chipped away. Then came the insulation layer. Fir boughs were the ideal material, but the technique of laying them was specific. The branches were placed with the cut end facing down and away from the sleeper, and the needled tips pointing up and toward the head. This created a shingled effect, where each branch overlapped the one below it. The result was a surface that had some give to it, some cushioning. More importantly, it trapped air in multiple layers. The bottom layer of branches sat against the frozen ground. The middle layers held pockets of air. The top layer, where the soldier's body rested, was springy enough to conform slightly to his shape. Straw worked similarly, though it compressed more easily under weight. Soldiers using straw had to add more of it, creating a thicker layer to compensate for the compression. Dry grass was less effective. It matted down quickly and provided minimal insulation after the first night. In some cases, soldiers had access to burlap sacks or pieces of old tent canvas. These were laid over the fir boughs or straw, creating an additional barrier. The fabric prevented the branches from poking through and helped hold the insulation in place. The overhead structure was where ingenuity showed most clearly. The simplest roof was just the shelter half stretched across the opening. Each American soldier carried half of a 2-man tent. When paired with another soldier's half, the 2 pieces buttoned together to form a small pup tent. But in a foxhole, a single half was often used alone, draped over the hole and weighted down at the edges. This kept out snow and rain. It blocked some of the wind, but it did not provide much thermal protection. Heat radiated through the thin canvas and escaped into the night air. So soldiers improved on this. When logs were available, they cut them to length and laid them across the top of the foxhole in a parallel arrangement, leaving a small gap for entry. The shelter half went over the logs. This created an air gap between the canvas and the interior of the foxhole. Air gaps reduce heat transfer. The logs also provided structural support, preventing the roof from sagging under the weight of snow. Snow was added deliberately. Soldiers would pile it on top of the canvas, building up a layer 6 inches thick, sometimes more. The snow had to be packed lightly. If it was packed too hard, it lost its insulating properties. The goal was to maintain the air spaces between the crystals. This snow layer transformed the foxhole. The temperature inside, though still well below freezing, might be 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the outside air. That difference was significant. It was the difference between moderate hypothermia and severe hypothermia, between sleep and wakefulness, between survival and not. The entrance was the weak point. It had to be large enough for a man to crawl through, especially if he was wearing bulky winter clothing. But every inch of open space was a place where heat could escape. Some soldiers used a blanket or a piece of canvas as a door, hanging it over the entrance and tucking the edges into the snow or frozen ground. This blocked drafts, but could be pushed aside quickly if they needed to exit. Others built a short trench leading to the entrance, creating an L-shaped profile. The entrance faced one direction, but the sleeping area was offset, around a corner. This prevented wind from blowing directly into the foxhole. It also made the interior darker, which helped with concealment. Ventilation was a concern that had to be balanced against warmth. A completely sealed foxhole could become dangerous. The men inside were breathing, consuming oxygen, and exhaling carbon dioxide. In a small, enclosed space, the carbon dioxide could build up to harmful levels. Symptoms of carbon dioxide poisoning included headache, dizziness, confusion, and eventually unconsciousness. So, a small opening was always left, even in the coldest weather. Sometimes, this was just a gap at the entrance where the door covering did not quite seal. Other times, it was a deliberate vent hole poked through the roof with a stick. The soldiers learned to feel the air inside the foxhole. If it felt stale, thick, hard to breathe, they knew they needed more ventilation. If it felt too drafty, too cold, they adjusted the coverings to reduce airflow. This constant adjustment was part of the nightly routine. The foxhole was not a static structure. It required maintenance, monitoring, small corrections. Snow had to be cleared from the entrance after a storm. The roof had to be checked for sagging. The insulation on the floor had to be fluffed and rearranged after it compressed. In longer occupations, when soldiers stayed in the same position for weeks, they improved their foxholes continuously. They added supports to the walls. They built small alcoves for storing equipment. They carved niches into the walls for candles, though open flames were rarely allowed. Some dug interconnected foxholes, creating a small network where soldiers could move between positions without exposing themselves above ground. These networks were more common on the Eastern Front, where the static nature of some sectors allowed for more permanent construction. But even the most elaborate foxhole was still just a hole, cold, dark, damp, cramped, and uncomfortable. It was home because there was nowhere else. It was shelter because the alternative was the open night. It was enough because it had to be. And when the soldiers crawled inside, pulled the blankets over themselves, and felt the presence of another body beside them, the foxhole became the place where they would spend the next few hours, waiting for their turn on watch, trying to sleep, trying to stay warm enough to wake again. The architecture of the hole was simple: dirt, logs, canvas, snow. But the knowledge embedded in that architecture was hard-won. It came from trial and error, from men who froze because their holes were too shallow, too wet, too exposed. By the second and third winters of the war, the veterans knew how to dig. They knew the angles, the depths, the materials. They knew what worked and what did not. And they taught the new arrivals, showed them how to place the fir boughs, how to angle the walls, how to build a roof that would hold snow without collapsing. This knowledge passed from soldier to soldier, foxhole to foxhole, winter to winter. It was never written down in the official manuals. It existed in practice, in the hands and muscles of men who had done it before, and it kept them alive. On the Eastern Front, where the war settled into months of static defense, the Red Army developed a different kind of shelter. It was called the Zemlyanka. The word translates roughly as earth-dwelling. It was more permanent than a foxhole, more substantial, more capable of supporting life through the long Russian winter. A Zemlyanka was a dugout structure, excavated deep enough to reach below the frost line. In most of Western Russia, the frost line extended down 1 to 2 meters. Below that depth, the ground temperature remained relatively stable, even when the surface air dropped to -30 or -40 degrees. This thermal stability was the foundation of the Zemlyanka's effectiveness. The earth itself became an insulator, buffering the interior from the extreme fluctuations of the surface. The construction process began the same way as a foxhole, with digging, but the scale was different. A Zemlyanka might measure 3 meters wide, 4 meters long, and 2 meters deep, large enough to accommodate 6 to 12 men. Digging such a space required days of labor. Even with multiple soldiers working in shifts, even with better tools than the standard infantry shovel, it was a massive undertaking. But in sectors where the front lines had stabilized, where it was clear that the position would be held for weeks or months, the effort was justified. Once the basic excavation was complete, the real construction began. The walls were reinforced with timber. Logs were cut from nearby forests and brought to the site. These logs were placed vertically along the walls, creating a solid barrier that prevented the earth from collapsing inward. In some cases, horizontal logs were used as well, creating a frame structure similar to a log cabin, but underground. The ceiling was the most critical element. It had to support the weight of the earth above, plus any snow that accumulated on the surface. The soldiers laid logs across the top of the excavation, parallel to each other, close together. These formed the primary support beams. Over the logs, they placed smaller branches, creating a lattice. Over the branches, they laid pieces of canvas or birch bark, if available. The earth layer was thick, often half a meter or more. From the outside, a well-built Zemlyanka looked like a low mound of dirt, barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. The entrance was a narrow trench, leading down at an angle into the main chamber. It prevented wind from blowing directly into the living space. It also acted as a cold trap. Cold air, being denser, would settle in the trench, while warmer air remained in the chamber. Inside the Zemlyanka, the space was organized carefully. Sleeping platforms were built along the walls, raised slightly off the floor. These platforms were made of logs or planks, covered with straw or fir boughs. The elevation kept the sleepers away from the coldest air, which settled near the floor. The center of the chamber was left open for movement and for the stove. The stove was what transformed the Zemlyanka from a simple dugout into a survivable winter shelter. Soviet soldiers improvised stoves from whatever materials they could find. Empty fuel drums were common. Ammunition boxes, if they were metal, could be adapted. In some cases, soldiers built small brick or stone stoves using mud as mortar. The stove burned wood. Forests covered much of the Eastern Front, so fuel was generally available, though it had to be gathered and carried back to the Zemlyanka. Scavenging wood became part of the daily routine. The stove had a chimney, usually a pipe or a stack of tin cans welded together, leading up through the roof. The chimney had to extend above the snow line to prevent smoke from being trapped inside, but it could not be too tall or too visible, as it would give away the position. When the stove was lit, the temperature inside the Zemlyanka rose significantly. It would not reach room temperature, not by any standard of comfort, but it might climb to just above freezing, or even a few degrees higher, enough to melt ice, enough to dry wet clothing, enough to allow the soldiers to remove their coats while inside. This warmth was precious. It allowed for genuine rest. Sleep in a Zemlyanka was deeper, more restorative than sleep in a foxhole. The metabolic rate did not have to stay elevated to fight the cold. Soldiers could recover from the exhaustion that accumulated during days in the field, but the stove also created risks. Smoke was a constant concern. If the chimney was blocked by snow or ice, smoke would fill the chamber. Carbon monoxide, invisible and odorless, could build up to lethal concentrations. Soldiers learned to monitor the air, to watch for symptoms of poisoning, headaches, nausea. If these appeared, the stove was immediately extinguished and the entrance was open to ventilate the space. Fire was another danger. Wood stoves, especially improvised ones, could overheat or develop cracks. Sparks could ignite straw bedding or wooden supports. A fire inside a Zemlyanka, with only one narrow exit, could be fatal, so the stoves were tended carefully. Soldiers took turns watching the fire, ensuring it burned steadily but not too hot. They kept the area around the stove clear of flammable materials. They inspected the chimney regularly. Despite the risks, the Zemlyanka was a sanctuary. Soldiers stationed in these positions spoke of them with a kind of affection. They were dark, smoky, crowded, and damp. But they were warm, and warmth, in the Russian winter, was everything. The German forces, in their first winter in Russia, had nothing comparable. They had not expected to be there in winter. Their plans assumed a quick victory, completed before the cold arrived, so they had not prepared. They had not built Zemlyankas, or anything like them. German soldiers spent that first winter in improvised shelters, in abandoned buildings, in foxholes that were inadequate for the extreme cold. The casualties from frostbite and hypothermia were staggering. Entire divisions were rendered ineffective. By the second winter, the Germans had learned. They began to dig deeper, to build stoves, to adopt some of the techniques they observed in captured Soviet positions. But they were always behind. The Red Army had centuries of experience living in this climate. The Germans were learning as they went, paying for each lesson with frozen limbs and lost lives. The Zemlyanka was not a Soviet invention. Similar structures had been used by Russian peasants for generations. They were a traditional form of shelter, adapted now for military use. The soldiers who built them were drawing on folk knowledge, on practices passed down through families, through villages. This cultural knowledge gave the Red Army an advantage that could not be matched by superior technology or training. It was a knowledge of how to live in the cold, how to build, how to insulate, how to survive. In sectors where the lines remained stable, Zemlyankas became small communities. Soldiers would personalize their spaces, carving shelves into the walls, hanging photographs or letters. They would cook communal meals on the stove, sharing rations and scavenged food. The social structure of the Zemlyanka was important. With 6 to 12 men living in such close quarters, disputes could arise easily. But the shared dependence on the shelter, on the stove, on each other's cooperation, enforced a kind of discipline. Arguments were settled quickly. Work was divided fairly. The soldier who gathered wood today would be relieved of other duties tomorrow. The man who maintained the stove was excused from guard duty. Everyone contributed, because everyone benefited. And at night, when the stove burned low and the soldiers lay on their platforms under piles of coats and blankets, the Zemlyanka was quiet. The earth above absorbed sound. The walls blocked the wind. The darkness was complete. In that darkness, men slept, not in 2-hour fragments, but in longer stretches. 4 hours, 6 hours. Sometimes, on quiet nights, even more. This was the gift of the Zemlyanka. Not just warmth, but rest. The kind of rest that allowed the body to recover, the mind to stabilize, the soldier to continue. It was not available to everyone. It required time to build, a static front, and the tools and materials to do the work. But where it existed, it made the difference between enduring the winter and being destroyed by it. The Zemlyanka was a hole in the ground, lined with logs, covered with earth, heated by a crude stove. It was simple, primitive by any modern standard, but it worked. And in winter, on the Eastern Front, that was all that mattered. Before the great winter campaigns of the Second World War, there was another conflict that taught the world how to fight in extreme cold. This was the Winter War, fought between Finland and the Soviet Union from November 1939 to March 1940. The Soviet Union invaded Finland with overwhelming force. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, complete air superiority. The Finnish army was small, poorly equipped, outnumbered by a factor of 3 to 1 or more. By all conventional measures, Finland should have been overrun in weeks. But the war lasted 3.5 months, and in that time, the Finns inflicted catastrophic losses on the Soviet forces. The primary weapon was not firepower. It was the cold, and the Finnish understanding of how to use it. The Finns were not visitors to winter. They lived in it. Their entire culture was adapted to the Arctic environment. They knew how to move through snow, how to shelter in forests, how to keep themselves warm with minimal resources. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, were often from warmer regions of the USSR. They had winter clothing, but it was inadequate for the conditions they faced. They had vehicles, but the vehicles broke down in the extreme temperatures. They had supply lines, but those lines stretched across frozen lakes and through dense forests where ambush was easy. The Finns used a tactic called motti. The word means a bundle of firewood, a stack of logs ready to be split. In military terms, it meant isolating a Soviet column, surrounding it, and letting the cold do the work. Finnish ski troops, dressed in white camouflage, moved through the forest silently. Each segment, isolated and unable to move, became a motti. The Soviet troops, trapped in these pockets, could not advance. They could not retreat. They tried to dig in, but the ground was frozen. They tried to build fires, but the Finns shot anyone who gathered wood. They tried to stay warm in their vehicles, but fuel ran out. And then they froze. Entire battalions were found weeks later, frozen in place. Men in trucks, in tanks, in makeshift shelters. The cold had killed them as efficiently as any bombardment. The Finns, meanwhile, slept in heated tents. These were not elaborate structures. They were simple canvas tents, large enough for a squad or a platoon. Inside each tent was a small wood-burning stove, similar to the stoves later used in Soviet Zemlyankas. The tents were set up behind the lines, in forests where they were concealed from aerial observation. The soldiers would return from patrol, from combat, and enter the tent. The stove would be burning, the interior would be warm. They could remove their outer layers, they could dry their clothing, hanging wet socks and gloves near the stove. This was the critical difference. The Finns were able to rest. Their bodies could recover from the exertion of skiing through snow, of fighting in the cold. Their minds could stabilize. The Soviets, trapped in mottis or in exposed positions, could not rest. They were fighting two enemies, the Finns and the cold, simultaneously. And the cold did not sleep. The Finnish ski troops themselves were remarkable. They moved on skis, covering distances that would have been impossible on foot through deep snow. They wore white overcoats and white coverings over their helmets, blending into the landscape. They carried light weapons, submachine guns, rifles, hand grenades. They did not need heavy firepower. Their advantage was mobility and surprise. They would strike, inflict casualties, and disappear into the forest before the Soviets could organize a response, and they knew the terrain. Every forest path, every frozen lake, every hill and valley. They used this knowledge to set ambushes, to avoid encirclement, to move through areas the Soviets considered impassable. The Soviet high command was humiliated by the Winter War. They had expected an easy victory. Instead, they suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties and were forced to sign a peace treaty that left Finland independent, though with some territorial losses. But the Soviets learned. After the Winter War, the Red Army reformed its winter equipment and tactics. They adopted the quilted cotton jacket, the telegraika, which provided better insulation than the previous wool coats. They introduced the ushanka, the fur hat with ear flaps, modelled after traditional Finnish and Russian headwear. They studied the motti tactic and developed countermeasures. They trained their troops to dig Zemlyankas, to build stoves, to survive in static positions through long winters. They also studied Finnish camouflage. The white overcoats became standard issue for Soviet winter troops. The concept of ski battalions was expanded. Mobility in snow became a priority. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army was far better prepared for winter warfare than it had been 2 years earlier. The lessons from Finland had been absorbed, institutionalized, passed down through training and doctrine. The Germans, by contrast, had not learned those lessons. They had observed the Winter War, but they had not internalized its implications. They believed their superior technology and training would overcome environmental challenges. They were wrong. The Finnish influence extended beyond the Soviets. Allied observers had studied the Winter War as well. The British and Americans noted the importance of winter clothing, of mobility in snow, of heated shelters. When American forces arrived in Europe, they brought some of this knowledge with them. The M1943 uniform system, with its layered approach to insulation, reflected lessons learned from Finland and from early Soviet experiences. The emphasis on small unit tactics in forested terrain, on camouflage and concealment, echoed Finnish methods. But knowledge is not the same as experience. The Americans had read about winter warfare. They had trained in winter conditions, to some extent, but most of them had never lived through a winter like the one they faced in the Ardennes. They learned quickly. The survivors learned, but the education was harsh. The Finns themselves continued to fight throughout the war. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Finland joined as a co-belligerent, seeking to reclaim the territory lost in the Winter War. Finnish troops fought on the northern front in conditions even more extreme than those of 1939 to 1940. They remained effective. Their tactics, their equipment, their cultural adaptation to the Arctic environment gave them an advantage that persisted throughout the conflict. And their legacy remained. The heated tent, the white camouflage, the ski troops, the understanding that winter itself could be a weapon. These became standard elements of winter warfare doctrine. The lesson of the Finns was simple. You cannot fight winter. You can only adapt to it. Those who adapted survived. Those who did not froze. Clothing was the first line of defense against the cold. Before shelter, before fire, before the proximity of others, there was fabric, the material wrapped around the body, the barrier between skin and air. Different armies approached this problem with different solutions, and the quality of those solutions determined, in many cases, who lived and who did not. The German Wehrmacht in 1941 invaded the Soviet Union wearing uniforms designed for temperate climates. The standard wool tunic and trousers were adequate for a European autumn. They were not adequate for a Russian winter. Wool is a good insulator when dry. The fibers trap air, creating pockets of warmth, but wool has limitations. It is heavy when wet. It loses much of its insulating capacity when saturated with moisture, and in extreme cold, wool alone is not enough. German soldiers froze. By December 1941, cases of frostbite overwhelmed the medical system. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, in newspapers, in anything they could scavenge. They took clothing from Soviet dead, from civilians, from abandoned buildings. The German High Command, recognizing the crisis, began to organize winter relief efforts. Civilians in Germany were asked to donate warm clothing: wool socks, scarves, gloves, sweaters. These items were collected, shipped east, and distributed to the troops. But the supply never matched the need, and much of the donated clothing was not designed for military use. Civilian sweaters, while warm, did not fit over uniforms properly. Scarves were too bulky. The clothing was a patchwork, inconsistent. By the second winter, the Germans had developed better equipment: fur-lined parkas, insulated trousers, improved gloves. But these items were expensive to produce and difficult to distribute. Not all units received them. And even with improvements, German winter clothing remained inferior to Soviet designs. The Soviet approach was different. It was based on generations of experience living in the coldest inhabited regions of the planet. The key garment was the telegraika. This was a jacket and trouser set made from quilted cotton. The outer layer was a heavy cotton canvas. Between the outer layer and the inner lining, there was a thick layer of raw cotton batting. Cotton batting, unlike wool, does not compress easily. It maintains its loft, its air-trapping capacity, even under pressure, and it remains relatively effective even when damp. Water passes through cotton more readily than through wool, so the fabric dries faster. The quilting pattern was important. The jacket and trousers were stitched in a diamond or square pattern, creating small pockets of batting. This prevented the cotton from shifting and clumping. Each pocket acted as an independent insulation cell. The telegraika was bulky. It added significant weight and restricted movement, but it worked. Soldiers wearing a telegraika could function in temperatures down to -30 or -40 degrees, as long as they kept moving and had adequate shelter at night. The Soviets also used layers. Underneath the telegraika, soldiers wore a wool tunic and trousers. Underneath that, wool or cotton undergarments. The layering allowed for adjustment. If a soldier was exerting himself, generating heat, he could remove the outer layer to avoid sweating. When he stopped, he put it back on. Sweating was dangerous. It was emphasized in training, repeated in orders, understood by every veteran. When you sweat, the moisture soaks into your clothing. When you stop moving, that moisture cools. And in sub-zero temperatures, it freezes. Wet clothing conducts heat away from the body much faster than dry clothing. A soldier who allowed himself to sweat and then stopped moving could go from warm to hypothermic in minutes. So the goal was to stay dry. Move steadily, but not hard. Adjust layers as needed. Avoid overheating. The American M1943 field uniform system embodied this principle. The base layer was wool. Long underwear, shirt, trousers. Wool insulates even when damp, so it provided a baseline of warmth. The middle layer was also wool. A wool sweater, often called a tanker jacket, which could be worn over the shirt. The outer layer was a cotton field jacket and trousers. The cotton was tightly woven, wind-resistant but breathable. It blocked the wind while allowing moisture vapor to escape. The system worked well in theory. In practice, soldiers often lacked some of the components. Supply issues meant that not everyone received the full set of layers. And even with the full set, the system had weaknesses. The primary weakness was the feet. The standard American combat boot was made of leather. It was durable, provided good support, and was adequate for most conditions. But in winter, it failed. Leather is not a good insulator. It conducts cold readily, and leather absorbs water. When boots got wet, from snow or from sweat, they stayed wet. The leather froze, becoming stiff and even colder. The design of the boot compounded the problem. It laced tightly, which restricted blood flow to the feet. Reduced blood flow meant reduced warmth. Soldiers found that their feet were often the coldest part of their body, and the boots had metal eyelets and hobnails in the soles. Metal conducts heat extremely well. The hobnails pulled heat directly out of the feet, transferring it to the frozen ground. The result was an epidemic of trench foot and frostbite. Trench foot is a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, damp conditions. The tissues of the foot begin to break down. The skin turns white, then red, then purple. It swells. Blisters form. Thousands of American soldiers were lost to trench foot during the winter of 1944 to 1945. Not killed, but rendered unable to walk, unable to fight. The eventual solution was the introduction of insulated boots and rubber overshoes. But these came late in the war, and they were not available in sufficient quantities. The Soviets, again, had a better answer. They used Valenki. Valenki are boots made from felted sheep's wool. The wool is compressed and shaped while wet, then allowed to dry. The result is a dense, rigid material that is extraordinarily warm. Felt does not conduct heat well. It traps air effectively, and it breathes, allowing moisture to escape while keeping cold out. Valenki were worn with portianki, foot wraps. These were rectangular pieces of cloth wrapped around the foot and lower leg in a specific pattern. The wrap technique distributed pressure evenly, prevented blisters, and allowed for adjustment. When portianki became wet, they could be unwrapped, dried by a fire, and rewrapped with the dry portion against the skin. The combination of Valenki and portianki kept Soviet soldiers' feet warm in conditions that disabled their German and American counterparts. The Germans eventually adopted some form of felt boots, but they never produced them in the quantities needed. German soldiers frequently scavenged Valenki from Soviet dead or prisoners. Headgear was another critical element. Heat loss from the head is significant. The scalp has a rich blood supply, and it is one of the few areas of the body that does not undergo vasoconstriction in the cold. Blood continues to flow to the head even when the fingers and toes are freezing. The Soviet ushanka, a fur hat with flaps that could be tied under the chin to cover the ears, became iconic. It was warm, effective, and simple. The Germans had similar designs, though their fur hats were less standardized. American soldiers often wore wool knit caps under their helmets, or wool jeep caps, when helmets were not required. But the helmet itself was a problem in extreme cold. Metal helmets conducted cold directly to the scalp. Soldiers learned to wear extra padding underneath, or to avoid wearing the helmet unless necessary. Gloves were essential but problematic. Thick gloves kept the hands warm but made it impossible to perform fine tasks. Loading a rifle, operating a radio, even opening a ration tin became difficult or impossible with heavy mittens. The solution was layered hand protection. Thin wool gloves for dexterity, with heavy mittens worn over them. When a task required fine motor skills, the mittens could be removed briefly, the task completed, and the mittens replaced. But even brief exposure was enough to numb the fingers in extreme cold. Soldiers had to work quickly, efficiently, before their hands stopped responding. Clothing in winter was not a static choice. It required constant management, adjusting layers, drying wet items, repairing tears and worn spots, checking for ice buildup. A soldier's routine included regular inspection of his clothing, looking for holes, weak seams, missing buttons. A small tear could become a large one under stress, and a large tear meant cold air penetrating the insulation. At night, wet clothing was dried if possible. This required a fire, or a stove, or simply body heat and time. Socks were particularly important. Soldiers would tuck wet socks inside their jackets, against their skin, using body heat to dry them slowly. The material of the clothing determined its maintenance requirements. Wool could be worn damp, cotton had to be dried. Leather had to be treated with oil or grease to prevent cracking when frozen. These were small details. But in winter, small details determined survival. The soldier who managed his clothing well, who kept his layers dry, who repaired damage promptly, who understood the properties of the materials he wore, had a better chance of enduring. The soldier who neglected these tasks, who allowed his clothing to deteriorate, who ignored the early signs of dampness or wear, paid the price in frozen limbs and lost capacity. Clothing was knowledge. It was skill. It was the daily, unglamorous work of staying alive. Of all the parts of the body, the feet suffered most. They were farthest from the core. The body's vasoconstriction protected the heart and brain by sacrificing the extremities, and the feet, being at the end of the longest vascular pathway, received the least blood flow. They were in constant contact with the frozen ground. Even through boots, through layers of socks or foot wraps, the cold of the earth conducted upward. Standing, walking, or lying down, the feet could not escape the relentless pull of heat into the frozen soil. They were enclosed. Boots, by necessity, fit snugly. This restricted circulation, and restricted circulation meant less warmth reaching the tissues, and they were often wet. Snow would melt from body heat, soaking into the boots. Sweat from marching would accumulate in the socks. Moisture, as always, was the enemy. The standard German jackboot, the Marschstiefel, was a well-made piece of leather. It was tall, reaching to just below the knee, providing support for the ankle and lower leg. It was durable, designed to last through years of use, but it was not designed for winter. The leather absorbed water readily. Once wet, it took hours or even days to dry, and drying required heat that was often not available. Wet leather froze solid, becoming rigid and even colder than dry leather. The hobnails in the soles, intended to provide traction, acted as thermal bridges. Metal conducts heat approximately 20 times faster than leather. The hobnails pulled warmth directly from the foot and transferred it to the ground with brutal efficiency. German soldiers stuffed their boots with straw, with paper, with strips of cloth, trying to create an insulating layer. Some wrapped their feet in rags before putting on their socks. Others wore multiple pairs of socks, though this often made the boots so tight that circulation was cut off entirely. Frostbite was rampant. The first stage, frostnip, caused numbness and pale skin. If caught early, it could be reversed by gentle rewarming, but soldiers often did not notice it in time, or could not stop to warm their feet. The second stage, superficial frostbite, penetrated deeper into the tissue. The skin turned white, then waxy. Blisters formed. Rewarming was painful, intensely so, and the tissue remained damaged. The third stage, deep frostbite, affected muscles, tendons, and bone. The foot turned black. Gangrene set in. Amputation was often necessary. By January 1942, German hospitals in the east were overwhelmed with frostbite cases. Some estimates suggest that frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in certain divisions during the first winter. The Americans faced a different but equally devastating problem. Trench foot is not caused by freezing. It occurs when feet are exposed to cold, damp conditions for prolonged periods, typically at temperatures just above freezing. The blood vessels constrict in response to the cold, reducing oxygen and nutrient delivery to the tissues. The symptoms begin with tingling and numbness. The feet feel heavy, swollen. The skin becomes pale or mottled. Pain follows, a deep, aching pain that makes walking difficult. If the condition progresses, the skin breaks down. Open, sores develop. Infection is common. The flesh begins to rot. The smell is distinctive, a sweet, sickly odor that medics learn to recognize immediately. In severe cases, the bones of the foot become visible through the decaying tissue. Amputation is the only option. Trench foot decimated American units in the Ardennes. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated, their feet too damaged to continue. The cause was clear. The standard leather combat boot, combined with inadequate shelter and the inability to dry feet regularly, created ideal conditions for the disease. Orders were issued. Soldiers were instructed to change their socks daily, to dry their feet whenever possible, to massage their feet to stimulate circulation. In a foxhole, under fire, with no heat source, how could a soldier dry his socks? Where would he get dry socks when supply lines were disrupted? How could he massage his feet when removing his boots meant exposing them to even colder air? The reality of the front line made the preventive measures impractical. Soldiers did what they could, but it was often not enough. The Soviet system, with Valenki and Portianki, avoided many of these problems. Felt, as a material, does not absorb water the way leather does. A damp Valenki boot would continue to insulate, and it would dry relatively quickly once the source of moisture was removed. Portianki, the foot wraps, could be adjusted easily. If one section became damp, the wrap could be redone with the dry portion against the skin and the damp portion on the outside. A soldier could carry a spare Portianki, a simple piece of cloth, more easily than spare socks. And Valenki were large. They fit loosely, with room for the foot to move. The downside was that Valenki provided less protection from physical hazards. They were soft, flexible. A sharp rock, a piece of metal, could penetrate them more easily than a hard leather boot. But in the context of winter survival, this was an acceptable trade-off. Soviet soldiers still suffered frostbite, but at much lower rates than their German or American counterparts. The Finns, again, had their own solution. They used a combination of leather boots and felt liners. The boot provided structure and protection, while the felt liner provided insulation. This was similar to the later American approach, but it was implemented from the beginning of the Winter War. By late 1944, the American military began issuing insulated boots, sometimes called shoe packs or Mickey Mouse boots, with felt or synthetic insulation. They were significantly warmer than the standard combat boot, but they arrived late, and they were issued in limited quantities, often prioritized for frontline infantry. Rear echelon troops, drivers, support personnel often still wore the old boots. The problem of the feet was never fully solved during the war. It was managed, mitigated, reduced. Soldiers developed routines. When they stopped for the night, the first priority, after establishing security, was to check their feet. They would remove their boots carefully, inspect their feet for signs of frostbite or trench foot, dry them as best they could, change socks if they had spares, and massage them to restore circulation. In a Zemlyanka, with a stove, this was relatively straightforward. Boots could be placed near the stove to dry. Feet could be warmed gradually. Socks could be hung on makeshift lines above the heat. In a foxhole, it was harder. There was no stove, no heat source except body warmth and, occasionally, a small candle or a pocket stove burning solidified alcohol. Some soldiers used the muff technique. They would wrap their feet in a blanket or coat before sleeping, creating an insulated pocket. This kept the feet warmer, but it also trapped moisture, which could make things worse if the wrapping stayed on too long. Others slept with their feet inside their packs, using the pack as an insulating barrier against the ground. This worked if the pack was empty or filled with soft items. A pack full of hard equipment provided little benefit. The buddy system extended to foot care. Soldiers would check each other's feet. It was easier to see early signs of frostbite on someone else's foot than on your own. The pale, waxy skin, the lack of sensation, the discoloration. If frostbite was detected early, the treatment was gentle rewarming. The affected foot could be placed against a companion's stomach or armpit, using body heat to gradually restore warmth. This had to be done slowly. Rapid rewarming could cause additional tissue damage. If the frostbite was advanced, there was little that could be done in the field. The soldier had to be evacuated to a medical station where proper rewarming facilities existed, but evacuation was not always possible. In active combat, in remote positions, a soldier with frostbitten feet might have to continue for days before reaching help. The pain was excruciating. Walking on damaged tissue caused further injury, but the alternative was to be left behind, so they walked, or tried to. The feet, those essential, overlooked extremities, bore the burden of winter in a way that no other part of the body did. They were the foundation of mobility. A soldier with frozen feet could not march, could not retreat, could not maneuver. He became immobile, dependent, a liability to his unit. And yet, protecting the feet was difficult. The solutions that worked felt boots. Frequent drying, loose-fitting footwear were not always available. The boots that were issued were often inadequate. The conditions did not allow for proper care, and so the feet froze. And the soldiers who owned those feet learned to limp, to adapt, to keep moving despite the pain. Or they were carried to the rear, their feet swaddled in bandages, their war over, their future uncertain. The problem of the feet was a problem of design, of supply, of knowledge. It was a problem that all armies faced, and that some solved better than others. But even the best solutions were imperfect. Winter did not care about design. It found the weaknesses, the gaps in protection, the moments of neglect, and it took what it could. Water, in winter, changed states constantly. The soldier's body added to this cycle, producing moisture through breath and sweat, releasing it into the air and into the fabric wrapped around him. Managing this moisture was as important as managing the cold itself. The American M1943 uniform system was built around a theory of vapor transmission. The idea was that moisture produced by the body should be allowed to escape through the layers of clothing, passing outward until it reached the air. If moisture was trapped against the skin, it would accumulate, saturate the fabric, and destroy the insulation. The system used 3 distinct layers, each with a specific function. The base layer, worn directly against the skin, was wool. Wool has a unique property among natural fibers. It can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture, while still feeling relatively dry to the touch. More importantly, wool continues to insulate even when damp. The fiber structure traps air in small pockets, and those pockets retain warmth even when the fiber itself is saturated. The middle layer was also wool, a shirt, trousers, sometimes a sweater. This layer provided additional insulation and absorbed moisture that passed through the base layer. The outer layer was cotton. The M1943 field jacket and trousers were made from a tightly woven cotton fabric treated to be wind-resistant. Cotton, unlike wool, does not absorb as much moisture. The tight weave blocked wind, which was critical, but the fabric remained breathable. Moisture vapor could pass through, escaping to the outside air. This was the theory. In practice, the system worked only under certain conditions. If a soldier was moving steadily, generating moderate heat, the layers functioned as designed. Moisture moved from the skin outward, passing through the wool, through the cotton, into the air. The soldier stayed relatively dry, but if the soldier exerted himself too much, generating excessive heat, he would sweat heavily. The wool base layer would absorb this sweat up to its capacity, but beyond that, the moisture would accumulate, the fabric would become saturated. And once saturated, it would lose much of its insulating value. When the soldier stopped moving, when his metabolic heat production dropped, the wet fabric became a liability. Heat conducted rapidly through the dampness. The soldier, who had been warm moments before, would begin to chill. If he did not have the opportunity to dry his clothing, the cooling would continue. In sub-zero temperatures, the moisture would freeze. The fabric would stiffen. The soldier would find himself encased in a shell of frozen cloth. So the goal was to avoid sweating in the first place. This required constant awareness. A soldier, marching through snow, carrying equipment, would begin to feel warm. His instinct might be to keep moving, to push through, but the veterans learned to stop, to remove a layer, to allow the heat to dissipate before sweat began. This was not always possible. In combat, you moved when ordered. You carried what you were told to carry. You did not stop to adjust your clothing because you felt warm, and so soldiers sweated. And then, when the action stopped, when they dug in for the night, they paid for it. The process of drying clothing in the field was difficult. The ideal method was to hang the wet garments near a fire or stove, allowing the heat to evaporate the moisture. But fires were often forbidden, especially at night, because they revealed positions to the enemy. Stoves, in a Zemlyanka or a bunker, made drying possible. Soldiers would string lines near the stove, hanging socks, gloves, undershirts. The wet fabric would steam, slowly releasing its moisture into the air. Within a few hours, the items would be dry, but in a foxhole there was no stove. Some soldiers would take a wet garment, a shirt or a pair of socks, and tuck it inside their coat, against their skin. The body heat would dry the fabric gradually. This was uncomfortable. The damp cloth against the skin pulled heat away. But over several hours, it would work. The problem was that this method dried the garment by transferring moisture to the body. The soldier's core remained warm enough to evaporate the moisture through respiration and through the outer layers. But it was an inefficient, slow process. Other soldiers simply accepted that some items would remain wet. They would rotate through their available clothing, wearing the driest items and leaving the wet ones to freeze. Frozen clothing, paradoxically, was sometimes easier to manage than damp clothing. The ice could be beaten out of the fabric, leaving it stiff but relatively dry. The outer cotton layer presented its own challenges. While it was designed to be wind-resistant, it was not waterproof. Snow that landed on the jacket would eventually melt from body heat. The water would soak into the cotton. And once the cotton was wet, it provided almost no insulation. Soldiers learned to brush snow off their clothing constantly. After moving through deep snow, after a storm, they would take a few minutes to beat the snow off their coats and trousers before it had a chance to melt. The Germans faced similar issues, but with less effective solutions. Their wool greatcoats were heavy and warm when dry, but they absorbed water readily. A wet greatcoat could weigh twice as much as a dry one, and it took a very long time to dry. German soldiers would sometimes wear their coats inside out, exposing the inner lining to the air to dry it while the outer layer remained damp. This was a stopgap measure, barely effective, but it was better than nothing. The Soviets, with their quilted telegraika, had an advantage. Cotton batting, layered between the inner and outer fabric, did not absorb water as readily as wool. Moisture could pass through the outer layer, but the batting itself remained relatively dry, and even if the outer layer became damp, the batting continued to trap air and provide insulation. But the telegraika was not perfect. It was bulky, which meant it restricted movement, and in very wet conditions, prolonged exposure to rain or wet snow, even the telegraika would eventually become saturated. Moisture also accumulated from sources other than sweat. Breath was a constant source. Every exhalation released water vapor. In cold air, this vapor condensed immediately, visible as a cloud of mist. Soldiers learned not to breathe directly into their scarves or coat collars. The moisture from their breath would condense on the fabric, freezing into a layer of ice. A scarf that seemed warm at first would become encrusted with ice, which would then melt against the skin when the soldier entered a warmer space, soaking the fabric. Instead, they learned to breathe into the open air, away from their clothing. This was uncomfortable in extreme cold, as the inhaled air would burn the throat and lungs, but it kept the clothing dry. Sleeping bags, when available, presented another moisture problem. The soldier's breath and body heat would create condensation inside the bag. Over multiple nights, this condensation would accumulate, freezing into a layer of ice on the inner surface of the bag. The soldier would wake to find himself encased in frost. To mitigate this, soldiers would turn their sleeping bags inside out when possible, allowing the ice to sublimate into the air during the day. But this required time and space, and it exposed the bag to snow and moisture from the environment. Most soldiers did not have sleeping bags. They had wool blankets, which they wrapped around themselves. Blankets did not trap moisture in the same way, but they also provided less insulation. The trade-off was constant. The management of moisture was a daily discipline. It required attention, planning, and small, consistent actions. Removing a layer before sweating, brushing off snow, drying items near a stove when possible, rotating through available clothing. It also required knowledge, understanding which fabrics could tolerate moisture and which could not, knowing when to prioritize warmth over dryness and when to do the opposite. A soldier who mastered moisture management improved his chances significantly. He stayed warmer with the same equipment. He suffered fewer cases of frostbite and trench foot. He could function more effectively in the cold. A soldier who ignored moisture, who allowed his clothing to become saturated, who did not take the time to dry items, degraded rapidly. His insulation failed. His body lost heat faster. He became more vulnerable to hypothermia, to injury, to exhaustion. The difference was knowledge, and the knowledge was not intuitive. It had to be learned, either from training or from experience, and experience, in winter, was often brutal. Veterans passed on what they knew. They showed new arrivals how to layer clothing, how to avoid sweating, how to dry items with body heat. They explained the risks of wet fabric, the importance of brushing off snow, the techniques for staying dry in a wet environment. This informal education saved lives. It was not in the manuals, not in the official doctrine. It was soldier to soldier, foxhole to foxhole, and it was part of the larger pattern. Survival in winter was not about one single technique or piece of equipment. It was about 100 small things, done correctly, consistently, day after day. Moisture was just one of those things. But it was critical. Water, in all its forms, was the constant companion of the winter soldier. Snow falling from the sky, ice forming on the ground, condensation on fabric, sweat on skin. Managing it, controlling it, minimizing its effects was an essential skill. But without it, the cold won faster. In the absence of fire, of heated shelters, of insulated sleeping bags, the most reliable source of warmth was the body of another human being. This was not comfort. This was biology. A resting human body produces approximately 100 watts of heat. This is the thermal output of a dim light bulb, not much, by any mechanical standard. But in a small, enclosed space, shared between 2 or 3 individuals, it was significant. The physics are straightforward. Heat radiates from the surface of the body into the surrounding air. In an insulated space, with multiple bodies, the air temperature rises. Not to comfort, but to a level measurably warmer than the exterior. And more importantly, bodies in direct contact share heat through conduction. Skin against skin, fabric against fabric. The heat that would otherwise radiate into empty space is instead transferred to the adjacent person. This principle was understood instinctively. Soldiers did not need to know the thermodynamics. They knew that sleeping beside someone else was warmer than sleeping alone. On the Eastern Front, this practice was formalized. Red Army soldiers were instructed to sleep in pairs or groups. The standard arrangement involved 2 men sharing their greatcoats. One coat was laid on the ground, providing insulation from the frozen earth. The 2 soldiers lay on top of it, side by side or front to back. The second coat was spread over them both, serving as a blanket. This configuration created a shared thermal envelope. The heat from both bodies was trapped beneath the upper coat. The lower coat prevented heat loss to the ground. The airspace between the men and the fabric warmed slightly. The temperature increase was modest, perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, sometimes 15, but in an environment where the ambient temperature was minus 30, this increase was the difference between survival and death. The positioning mattered. Lying front to back, often called spooning, maximized surface contact. The chest of one man against the back of another, legs overlapping, arms wrapped around the forward person. This position was psychologically difficult for many. It was intimate in a way that violated cultural norms. Men did not, in normal circumstances, hold each other like this. But on the front line, normal circumstances did not exist. The alternative was to freeze. And so they learned to accept it, to press together without shame, without discomfort, because the body's need for warmth overrode every social convention. American soldiers developed similar practices, though often without explicit instruction. The first night in a foxhole, shivering alone under a single blanket, was a harsh teacher. The second night, they moved closer to their companion. The American system typically involved more blankets. Each soldier was issued at least 2, sometimes more. These were pooled. 5 blankets between 2 men, layered over both of them. The weight of the blankets compressed the air pockets, reducing insulation slightly, but the combined coverage was still better than separate sleeping. The buddy pairs would rotate positions through the night. The man on the outer edge, exposed to the colder air, would switch places with the man on the inner side after a few hours. This ensured that neither man bore the full burden of the cold position for the entire night. In larger groups, 3 or 4 men might huddle together. The men on the outside suffered more, but the man in the middle was significantly warmer. Rotations were essential. No one could remain in the coldest position for the full night without risking hypothermia. The social dynamics of this closeness were complex. Trust was required. You were vulnerable when sleeping, defenseless. You had to trust that your companion would wake you for your watch rotation, that he would not take more than his share of the blankets, that he would alert you if danger approached, and you had to trust him with your body heat. If one man was already hypothermic, his body producing insufficient heat, he became a liability. He pulled warmth from his companion without contributing enough in return. There are accounts of soldiers making the decision to separate from a companion who was too cold, who had slipped too far into hypothermia. It was a brutal calculation. Stay together, and both might die. Separate, and one might survive. Most soldiers did not make that choice. They stayed together. They used their own body heat to try to warm their companion, even at cost to themselves. This was partly compassion, partly the understanding that tomorrow the roles might be reversed. But the decision was always there, unspoken, in the coldest hours. The physical closeness also created practical challenges. Movement was difficult. If one man needed to get up, for guard duty or to relieve himself, he disturbed the other. The shared blankets had to be lifted. Cold air rushed in. The thermal envelope was broken. Re-establishing warmth after such a disturbance took time. The men would press together again, pull the blankets tight, wait for the air to warm, but the interruption was inevitable. Sleep in winter was never continuous, never undisturbed. Breath was another factor. Breathing produced moisture and carbon dioxide. 2 men, breathing in a small, enclosed space, could create a build-up of both. The air became thick, stale. Some ventilation was necessary, which meant allowing cold air in, which reduced the temperature. The balance had to be managed constantly. Too much ventilation, and the space was too cold. Too little, and the air became unbreathable. Some soldiers arranged themselves head to foot, so that they were not breathing directly on each other. This reduced moisture accumulation on clothing and improved air quality slightly, but it also reduced the effective contact area, making the shared warmth less efficient. The optimal configuration depended on the specific conditions: temperature, wind, available insulation, the size of the shelter. Soldiers experimented, adjusted, found what worked for their particular situation. In the Soviet Zemlyanka, where space was less constrained and a stove provided additional heat, the sleeping arrangements were more relaxed. Men still slept close together on the platforms, sharing blankets and coats, but the desperate pressure to maximize contact was reduced. The stove provided a baseline warmth that made individual variations possible. A soldier who preferred more space could sleep slightly apart. A soldier who was particularly cold could move closer to the stove. But even with a stove, the proximity of others was valuable. The stove might go out during the night, fuel exhausted, or the fire tended poorly. When that happened, the soldiers reverted to shared body heat. The Finns, in their heated tents, had the luxury of individual sleeping spaces, but even they understood the value of proximity. In the coldest conditions, when fuel was scarce or the stove could not be lit, they too would huddle together. The warmth of another person was universal. It transcended nationality, doctrine, equipment. It was a fundamental human response to cold. We are social animals. We seek each other in darkness, in cold, in fear. On the front lines, this seeking was stripped of all pretense. It was not affection, though bonds formed. It was not desire, though the intimacy was profound. It was need, biological, urgent, undeniable. The soldiers who survived the winter often spoke of this closeness in later years. Some with embarrassment, some with matter-of-fact acceptance, but many with a kind of quiet gratitude. They had been held. In the coldest, darkest hours, they had been held by another human being, and that holding had kept them alive. The warmth of another was not just thermal, it was psychological. The presence of someone else, the sound of breathing, the slight movement of a body beside you, was a reminder that you were not alone. Isolation in the cold is terrifying. The mind begins to wander, to imagine, to spiral into dark places. But with another person there, those spirals were interrupted. The other person anchored you to reality, to the present moment. You would whisper to each other sometimes. Quiet conversations in the dark, jokes, complaints, observations. These conversations were brief. Talking used energy, and energy was precious, but they served a purpose. They kept the mind active, alert, human, and when the talking stopped, when sleep finally came, the warmth remained. Shared, steady, enough. The physical closeness required for survival created an unspoken agreement between soldiers. This was not formalized, not written into orders or regulations. It emerged from necessity and was maintained through mutual dependence. The covenant had several components, all essential. First, equality of burden. If two men were sharing a foxhole, sharing blankets, sharing body heat, then both had to contribute equally to the work of survival. One could not expect the other to bear more of the cold, more of the watch rotations, more of the physical labor. This meant that positions were rotated. The soldier on the outer edge of the huddle, exposed to colder air, would not remain there all night. After 2 or 3 hours, the positions would switch. The inner man moved out. The outer man moved in. This rotation was understood without discussion. It happened automatically, a rhythm established on the first night and maintained thereafter. To refuse to rotate, to insist on remaining in the warmer position, was a profound violation. It marked a man as untrustworthy, selfish, unworthy of the partnership. Second, vigilance. The man on watch was responsible not only for detecting enemy movement, but also for monitoring his companion. He watched for signs of hypothermia, shivering that became too violent or stopped entirely, confusion, slurred speech, lethargy. If these signs appeared, the watch had to wake the sleeping man, force him to move, to generate heat, to stay conscious. The sleeping man, especially if he was slipping into hypothermia, did not want to wake. But the watch had to insist, gently at first, then more firmly, shaking the shoulder, speaking loudly, pulling the blankets back to force exposure to cold air, shocking the system into alertness. This was an act of care, even when it felt cruel. The man being woken might be angry, resentful, but he would be alive. Third, resource sharing. Blankets, coats, food, warmth. These were pooled. If one man had 3 blankets and the other had 2, they became a shared set of 5. If one man received extra rations, they were divided. This was not altruism, it was practicality. A companion who froze, who starved, who weakened, became unable to contribute. He could not take his turn on watch. He could not help with digging or gathering wood. He became a burden rather than a partner. Keeping both men functional required keeping both men fed, warm, and rested as much as possible. There were exceptions. If one man was ill, if he had been injured, the healthy man might take on more of the burden temporarily. But this was understood to be temporary. The expectation was that when the situation reversed, the care would be reciprocated. Fourth, honesty about capacity. A soldier had to communicate when he was reaching his limit. If his feet were going numb, he had to say so. If he was too tired to remain alert on watch, he had to admit it. If he felt the confusion of hypothermia beginning, he had to speak. This required overcoming pride, overcoming the military culture that equated any admission of weakness with failure. But within the buddy pair, honesty was necessary. Without it, both men were at risk. The companion needed accurate information to make decisions. Should we try to move to a warmer position? Should we wake each other more frequently? Should we combine all our blankets rather than keeping some separate? These decisions could only be made with honest assessment of the situation, and that assessment had to come from both men. Fifth, silence when needed. The closeness of the huddle meant that every sound, every movement, every breath was audible. Snoring, shifting position, muttering in sleep, these were inevitable, but they had to be tolerated. Complaining about a companion's snoring, about the way he moved during the night, about his cold feet pressing against your legs, served no purpose. It created tension, resentment, division. The covenant required forbearance. You accepted the discomforts of sharing space because the alternative was worse. You did not complain. You endured. This silence extended to personal matters. Soldiers lost control of bodily functions sometimes, from illness, from cold, from exhaustion. Urinating or defecating in the close confines of a foxhole was humiliating. But it happened. The companion did not mention it, did not mock, did not express disgust. The covenant required dignity, even in the most undignified circumstances. The huddle also created vulnerability that extended beyond the physical. Soldiers had nightmares. They cried out in their sleep, reliving combat, reliving fear. The covenant required that these moments remain private. What happened in the huddle, what was said or done in the dark, was not discussed in daylight. It was not shared with others. It remained between the two men. This created a bond that was deeper than friendship. It was not based on shared interests or affection. It was based on shared survival, on having seen each other at the lowest, most vulnerable points, and choosing to protect that vulnerability. Many soldiers maintained these bonds after the war. They wrote letters, visited, remained in contact for decades. The connection forged in the winter foxhole did not dissolve when the war ended. Others never spoke of it again. The intimacy was too intense, too associated with trauma and suffering. They preferred to leave it in the past, but all of them, in their own ways, carried the memory. The memory of being cold, of being afraid, of being held, and of holding someone else through the night. The covenant also had boundaries. There were limits to what could be asked or expected. If one man had food and the other did not, the expectation was that it would be shared. But if one man had received a letter from home, a photograph, a small personal item, that was his. It was not subject to the communal pooling. Emotional support was freely given, but emotional demands were not made. You could listen to your companion talk about home, about fear, about doubt, but you could not demand that he talk, could not insist that he share what he was not ready to share. The covenant was maintained by mutual respect. Each man recognized the other as equally human, equally deserving of warmth and safety, equally trapped in the same nightmare. This recognition prevented the breakdown of the partnership. Even when tensions arose, when exhaustion made tempers short, the underlying understanding held. We are in this together. Neither of us can survive alone. There were failures, partnerships that dissolved, usually because one man violated the covenant in some fundamental way, taking more than his share of rations, falling asleep on watch, refusing to rotate positions, When a partnership failed, both men suffered. They had to find new companions, rebuild trust, re-establish routines, or they had to survive alone, which was harder and more dangerous. Most partnerships held. The pressure of the environment enforced cooperation. The alternative was too stark. And so the huddle continued, night after night. 2 men, sometimes 3, pressed together under layers of wool and canvas, breathing the same cold air, sharing the same small space. It was not comfortable. It was not pleasant. The covenant of the huddle was simple. I will keep you alive, and you will keep me alive. I will share what I have, and you will share what you have. I will watch over you, and you will watch over me. And when morning comes, we will do it again.